Hi everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Sales Think Tank from LinkedIn. This is a show that brings you sales thought leadership from sales industry experts and the world's largest professional network. We're live from our new studio in our EMEA headquarters here in Dublin, Ireland, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. My name is Jack McKeown, Sales Director for LinkedIn Sales Solutions, and I will be your host. Now, usually on this show, we talk to all manner of sales roles, many of them quota carriers and their managers and leaders. Today, we're looking at a different group of stakeholders in the sales and business development space, revenue operations, or RevOps. The reason for this is that role types like these, which are responsible for the revenue streams and profitability of an organization, have never been so important. LinkedIn data is showing that as time goes on, the buying committee at sales accounts are getting larger and more complex. And nowadays, they almost always include RevOps executives. So it's unsurprising that LinkedIn Jobs Research found that head of revenue operations is the fastest growing job role in the United States today. So we'd like to pick the brains of those involved, find out what challenges they're solving for, what opportunities they see on the horizon, and how they plan to get there. It's going to be a very enlightening chat, I'm sure. Now, two quick housekeeping notes before we dive in. First off, a recording of this webinar will be available afterwards on the LinkedIn Sales Solutions website and on our social channels. And secondly, we've got a team in the background ready to answer any questions you have today. So please drop them into the Q&A box or in the comments section and we'll get back to you ASAP. So, without further ado, let's get familiar with our expert panel for today's episode. My guests today are Shantanu Shekhar from Gong, Geraldine McCarthy from Personio, and Lucy Peridon from Funnel. Now, before that, I ask them to introduce themselves properly. I'll also ask them to kick off in a traditional LinkedIn icebreaker and tell us one thing that's not on your LinkedIn profile as well. So if I can start with you, Geraldine.
Sure, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm Geraldine McCarthy and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Personio. Personio is an all-in-one HR solution for small and medium businesses, and it's also one of the fastest growing businesses in Europe at the moment. Interesting fact about me is it is a little bit on LinkedIn, so I hope this answer isn't cheating, but I have an identical twin sister, so if anybody has enough time, maybe they can look on LinkedIn and see if they can find my doppelganger.
It's definitely you here today, Geraldine. All right, very interesting fact. Shantanu.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Jack. So I'm Shantanu Shekhar. I'm the Senior Director of Go-to-Market Operations at Gong. Go-to-market operations at our company is the same as revenue operations as RevOps in some other places. What Gong does, we're basically a revenue platform, which is based on AI, which is, I know, the flavor of the month, but we've pretty much been an AI pioneer in the revenue tech stack for the last 7-8 years now. One fun fact about me, which is not on my LinkedIn profile, and I'm an ex-LinkedIn alum, so I've done this before, that's again, that's cheating in a way, is I've been a father now for about 4 years. It's probably the trickiest job I've ever had, but also the most rewarding. So.
Oh, fantastic.
Excited to be here.
I couldn't agree more. Lovely to have you with us today, Shantanu. And Lucy.
Yes, hi. It's lovely to be here. I'm Lucy Peridon. I'm the Vice President of Revenue Development at Funnel. Funnel is the marketing data hub allowing the world's marketers to connect, store, organize and share their marketing data, giving them confidence in their marketing analytics. I'm also head of the Dublin office here in Ireland, which is a fun second hat I wear. Something that's not on my LinkedIn profile is that I love to bake. And I actually volunteer with an organization here in Ireland called Considerate Cakes, which I really love because it's a small thing, but we bake goods for homeless distribution. And we make birthday cakes for people who don't have access to a kitchen, like in direct provision. So it's nice to mix my passion with something that gives back a little bit.
That is fabulous. Quite inspiring, Lucy. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Change the world with a brownie.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's what can you do today, right? I'm going to get into the questions, and I might start with you, Shantanu, and get everybody's perspective on this. When we talked about RevOps at the outset being one of the fastest growing roles in the world now and in the US today. When we see these roles grow quickly, sometimes they don't always mean the same thing at every company, right? Sometimes there's a slightly different understanding of what RevOps is. What I'd like to get a flavor of from each of the three of you is, in your organization, what really is the RevOps role? What does it encompass? And if I could start, Shantanu, you're in go-to-market, you're pretty close to the heart of this. What's it for Gong?
Super, Jack. This is pretty much, you're right. I think what you just mentioned about the evolution of RevOps and the function as a whole has changed a lot. So this definition is largely true for most of the B2B tech and SaaS organizations. If I think about really what RevOps is, I have a framework which is, if you'll humor me, there's 4 pillars.
Yep.
And there's a base and a top, right? So the 4 pillars for me, number 1 is go-to-market strategy.
Yep.
And that's how do you think about both longer term as well as shorter term strategy as you're trying to really accelerate the entire go-to-market engine or the revenue engine of your company. Second to me is pure play operations, and that's twofold, which is processes as well as systems, which will help you optimize not just the customer life cycle, but also talent life cycle at your company.
Yep.
The third piece, and this is where it'll be a bit of a hot take, the third one I'd probably call it data, but not just data, but insights. And the reason is there's so much data around us, but how do you separate the signal from the noise? And how do you use insights to really drive decisions? That's very important. And the fourth one, and some companies might think of this as a separate pillar from RevOps, but over time I've seen this more and more coalescing within the RevOps family, is enablement. Because once you have all of these pieces of strategy, systems, processes, and data, how do you really get enablement across the customer-facing teams to drive forward?
Yep.
Right? And all of these 4 pillars really have these 2 overarching themes that I mentioned about customer lifecycle at the base, because how do you really optimize for the customer? And second, talent lifecycle, anyone that you're basically adding to your revenue organization or go-to-market organization, all the way from onboarding to really thriving and being productive, how do you drive that? So that to me is, in essence, what RevOps is all about.
Okay, fantastic. That's a pretty full perspective. Lucy, over to you.
I must admit I don't have a whole lot of things to add on top of that. For us, enablement is still a separate function.
Right.
But our revenue operations team has recently started sharing insights, pulling from the data. And that is something that has added such value to our organization. It's an amazing moment because we get all of the leaders of the different revenue roles in the room, and we're looking at the data and actually making real business decisions based on those insights. So for us, that has been a game changer over the last 6 months or so. Yeah.
Geraldine, anything?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, and we do put enablement and the rest of RevOps together, and I think you get great insights with the 2 together. Actually, because we're still a relatively early stage company and because we have a lot going on in our business, we actually put in other functions under RevOps that you would not traditionally consider as RevOps. So roles like solution engineering, we're putting in there because we see RevOps as, a very central construct to make all of the sales teams much more efficient and productive. So it's kind of the way that both Lucy and Shantanu have described, but even adding a bit more further in there as well. And I think it is interesting just to hear the 3 of us talking. It does vary really for
absolutely.
the company.
Absolutely. I'd like to talk to you all. I might start with you, Lucy, about how you focus your teams, right? With deep sales, one of the things we talk about and I've discovered a lot is that the best salespeople and indeed the best teams know where to focus their attention and how to laser in, right? So we talk about the accounts with the most white space, that where the opportunity is to really make hay. How do you focus your teams on those those accounts within their territories that really are the big opportunities?
Absolutely. So at Funnel, we are still a scale-up company. So our account executives don't have territories at this point. However, within revenue development, we have the inbound lead flow. We also do outbound prospecting. That's there's a huge amount of leads coming in all sorts of directions. And the revenue operations team have actually been crucial to us because they have helped us build out an automatic lead score, which allows us to look at what is the quality of that inbound lead flow. But also they've helped us for the outbound in building out lists. So you're talking about that data pillar. And so that means that all of the revenue development reps and also the sales teams, when it comes to the outbound, they're able to focus on that highest quality, highest impact. And for outbound, we know that we have the accounts that are the best fit for our ICP. So they are focusing on what they do best, which is selling, rather than going digging for opportunities. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I would do a +1 to what you just said, Lucy, because if I think about the dichotomy between inbound and outbound, inbound literally it's all about how do you use the lead scoring process to get to a high quality leads, go and get really to the seller as quickly as possible. In fact, there are studies which find that the slower you are in responding to an inbound lead, the less likely you are to actually win. So it's very important to get that. There are SLAs that most companies have sometimes in minutes, not even hours, to respond. So I think that's something which we do as well in terms of tiering those accounts. from an inbound perspective. But if you think about outbound sales, and we do, again, this is where it's so interesting, all of our companies have some differences here and there, and I'm sure that's true for most of our listeners as well, that we do build books for each of our sellers or account executives, and similarly an existing customer base as well. The way we think about it is literally twofold, which is how do you really understand for each account what's the size of price, which is how attractive is the account based on firmographics, demographic information about the company, about the size, growth, revenue, so on and so forth. But also we then do a second layer, which is propensity to buy.
Yes.
And not all businesses will fit your solution. How do you find the right businesses which fit your solution? You can get intent data. There are a lot of systems on the ecosystem now which actually give you that information. But literally, how do you drive that both based on buyer behavior as well as user behavior? So that's something which we try and map, and we then have a recommended tier. But then you also want to really empower the seller to be able to then tier based on this data input or insight. This is how I'm going to triage my accounts, and then they are able to tier A, B, and C.
Right. Very, very interesting. And I think you do see that a lot of organizations start off with the agility that you speak of, Lucy, and not feeling confined, and then we get to this scale where we need to start thinking in the way Shantanu describes of, understanding the size of prize and the intent, etc. Geraldine, for you, how does that look today?
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing what Lucy and Shantanu are talking about, because a lot of it resonates with how we think about things and how we've built stuff over time. But actually, one of the other areas that we're thinking about is not just is a customer inbound or outbound, because invariably customers are going to be interacting with you in multiple channels and in varying different ways. And so how can you actually stitch together all of that information in a much more structured way? So back to Shantanu's point about that, systems and infrastructure and your data, pulling those together to make much more informed decisions and ultimately to make your teams more productive. It's kind of part of a sophistication of evolution of a journey. And I think we're still on that journey, but definitely how we think about it as we're growing at the moment.
Omnichannel.
Yeah, exactly.
And with that theme, Geraldine, and I might stay with you, we're seeing the role of RevOps evolve a lot over the last few years. How do you see that changing, and what do you think are the necessary requirements for somebody in that role today?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that's changing. I think it's a really exciting part of the business. I think when you think about how sales works now compared to 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it is a much more structured and data-driven way of operating, and RevOps is the central pillar to allow you to do that. Making sure that you can really have the right teams and infrastructure in place to do that, to drive the right decisions. So whether that's about driving individual deals that you know more about, or whether it's about making the right strategic level decisions around what territories you go into or where you want to focus, like on your ICPs, as Lucy mentioned, that you have those decisions around where you're going. And so I think the evolution of RevOps is really about taking what is already there and really bringing a lot of value to help get organizations to the next level.
All right, thank you. Shantanu, you see some change yourself?
Yeah, I think, and I love what Geraldine said about adding value to the organizations. I think that's, to me, is almost a two-pronged difference about how RevOps has evolved over the last few years and why you're seeing the statistic you just mentioned. I think number one, you're seeing RevOps being a lot closer on how companies adding customer value. And I think that understanding of customer, because if I think about, and I almost go back 5 to 10 years even, a lot of RevOps work was in siloed data, not really as much based on the feedback loop you're getting from customers. I think a lot more RevOps people are actually in front of customers now, and I think that's great to see happen as well. And the second piece, which is more a sign of the times, especially in the tech world right now, RevOps has been focused, let's think about optimization and growth, and let's move forward on that. With the uncertainty in the market and the focus on margins and longer term customer lifetime value, that's again where RevOps is really being empowered and thinking about how do you really drive not just shorter term growth, but longer term value for the company.
So we're probably seeing the role itself evolving, and then to this backdrop of a very changing economy over the last probably 15 months globally. That's required.
And that's helping, if I may use the phrase, a lot of RevOps executives are now actually getting a seat at the table.
Right.
Because of that shift in thinking.
Yeah, it's so necessary. Lucy, if I can come to you, we're seeing a lot more technology involved in go-to-market strategy right now. And one of the challenges is how do we get all these technologies to talk to each other and be integrated? How have you seen that challenge?
I think it's vital to have RevOps involved from the absolute beginning. And I speak from experience, having sometimes gone about it the wrong way. So you learn those lessons. Because there are so many different tools available and different teams are using different tools, RevOps becomes the main central point of reference, who are the people who manage and run and understand all of those tools. So I always believe strongly in collaboration and communication. And at Funnel, what we have is a very strong system where anybody can propose a tool, but it has to be reviewed. And RevOps is part of that review process. So we make sure that we have all the right stakeholders in the room, and that means that we're able to see, does it integrate with our existing tech stack? Does it fit the business need that we have at this time? Because sometimes there's good intentions, but actually the tool can't actually fit the need. So it's all about aligning the stakeholders, getting everybody on the same page at the very beginning, so that we can foresee any particular problems that might come around the corner.
Yeah, I think we heard a lot of people talking maybe a couple of years ago about more tech stack, and that conversation evolved into the right tech stack, really, particularly again with this economic backdrop over the last year or so. Geraldine, how about for you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in there. I definitely agree, right tech stack is right, and that you have the pieces that integrate for what's needed. So ideally within your tech stack you have pieces that integrate really seamlessly, so it doesn't feel like you're jumping from tool to tool, and that's really from an end user perspective. I think the other piece then to think about is, from a more strategic perspective, when you have all these tools, they're all pulling in different levels of insights or data points, and making sure that you've defined what you mean by something. So, if you've defined what industry means, that is the same definition as you're implementing those tools, so that you're not pulling out one set of insights from one tool and then a different from another tool, and they're giving you contradictory information. Otherwise you've really kind of lost some of that really value added information that you can get from having everything working together.
Yeah, I was going to come to you, Geraldine, and you've kind of edged into it there about how you've leveraged technology and data analytics to enhance your sales strategy and drive better results over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about data is a couple of things. First of all, the data never lies. And so you can be talking about a lot of different things in the business. You might have hypotheses about what's happening, and really going back to the data either to validate the data points that you already have. That can be a really good way to do stuff. But I think the other piece about data is also to bring it back in and to challenge some of the conventional wisdom that you have in your business. And when I think back, particularly over the last 3 years, the macro environment has been so variable. Getting the data to really either validate or challenge what you think about your business can help you. And that might be, for example, well, we think that this segment of customer is the right segment for us to go after, but the data is telling you it's a slightly different segment. Or it might be, well, we see that we think that this market might be slowing down because of economic reasons, but the data is showing you otherwise. I think that's really where data can help you, really, as you think about a broad scale organisation, to make the right decisions around what you're doing, and it's not just gut feeling.
Moving on from the gut feel. Lucy, is that something that you've seen over the last few years, where you're using technology and data analytics to really get your sales strategy more specific and focused on where you want to be?
Absolutely, and it's also something we kind of skated over but didn't quite get to mentioning, is that the role of these tools and of this data, we actually want to make the reps' lives simpler.
Yes.
We want to make the reps' lives better, so we want to cut the noise. So a great example that we went through last year was we have a chat on our website, a live chat, and we had lots and lots and lots of chats. So technically a good thing.
Yes.
Except for most were for finance or support or for customer success. So that was actually an inefficient use of the revenue development team. So what we did is we sat down with RevOps, we completely redesigned the chat flow. We ended up having 4 times fewer chats, but more pipeline generated.
Wow.
And that is such a brilliant example of the collaboration, the use of the data, making sure that we were giving people the best buying or customer experience possible, but also being a more efficient sales process at the end of the day.
Fantastic. So
that's such a great example, Sarvina. But if I think about that example which you just mentioned, because as a seller today, on average, we did a survey earlier this year, last year. As a seller, on average, you touch 6 systems to do 1 deal.
Wow.
On average. And that's again an average. Some large enterprises might be a lot more, some smaller companies might be fewer. So if you think about just the proliferation of tools and systems in the market, on the last count, there are almost 10,000 marketing plus sales tech systems out there. Wow. So how do you move away from rep frustration? How do you drive more productivity? And eventually, how do you really battle revenue loss? Is going to be down to how you're using systems and the data from that in the right manner. And that's where a large part of, in fact, tech stack consolidation is probably the one word I hear, or the one phrase I hear more than anything these days. So it's great that you bring that up.
And if we stay on data for a moment, because it's so central to all of this conversation, Shantanu, I'll stay with you if I can, but how do you ensure you're acting on data that's high quality and trustworthy?
That's a very good point. I'd almost think about it in three ways, Jack. I think number one, I think, is more, and I'll come back to each of those three in detail, but is more to do with the tech stack and how you think about where you're getting data from. Second, for me, it's literally how do you triangulate that information. And the third piece is how do you remove the almost manual nature of data entry and how do you come back to that? So what I mean by these three is, number one, from tech stack, there was some research from Forrester which talked about really tech stack consolidation help not just driving costs down, because if you're using 6 systems down to 2, you obviously have some economies of scale, but you also get better integrated workflows and you get more reliable data. And that's very, in fact, that's something which we've been, and I know both Lucy and Geraldine are customers of ours at Gong. That's something we've been trying to do, is go across the customer life cycle. It all goes back to that to me in RevOps. How do you really drive that? Second, to me, about triangulation. I've been a customer to LinkedIn Sales Insights, probably one of the first ones in Europe to use it 3 years ago. And if I think about, there are so many different sources of data. And data can be account data, company data, contact data, eventually how you're using it, all the different systems you're capturing data from. How do you really make that as clean as possible and triangulate from the most dynamic sources? I think that's very important. And that's why I think LinkedIn Sales Insights is great, because it gives you a more automated insights and you combine that with all the other systems across. So we do that in Gong. We try and have a few sources we're getting our contact data from. And the third piece is, as much as possible, if you eliminate the manual entry. For those of us who've been sellers before, it is a very manual process having to go in and enter data on the CRM. Maybe 5% of what actually transpired gets captured. So how do you really eliminate that manual entry and make it more flexible and efficient for each person? And that's something which, again, RevOps teams would be looking to drive more efficiency for the team so that there's more give and take across the piece. So that really helps in getting more consolidation across.
Geraldine, you talked a lot about the importance of data, and we said, hey, we don't want to be doing too much on our gut instincts and having that data. How do you solve this problem and make sure you're working on data that's high quality and trustworthy?
Yeah, Shantanu's talked about a lot of really great stuff there, but I think there's also some other areas that you can work on in terms of how you set up, how you capture the data. And you think about, that sounds like a very basic thing, but actually the thoughtfulness in capturing that data will actually drive accuracy in the data. So for example, if it is a manual entry, that you put in as many drop-down fields rather than manual entries, or if it's something that you absolutely want to understand, that you make it a mandatory field that gets captured. So I think there are probably some ways, particularly on the sales side, where you're talking about people are interacting with data to make sure that it's really high quality. And then I think the second is to really understand what you mean when you define something. So for example, if you're talking about an industry, that you're very clear what that industry means. You might talk about tech as an industry, but actually in the same way we spoke about RevOps looking different in every company, I'm pretty sure every company would define tech slightly differently. So as you define stuff, that you get very clear on, we're using industry as an example, industry and sub-industry, and so that when you're making those decisions, you understand what the data means, as opposed to, oh, we said this, but actually it really means something else. So I think there's kind of fundamental pieces and then very thoughtful pieces as you kind of guide things through.
Clarity and guiding the humans very prescriptively.
Yeah,
I think so.
The right, and I think also we live in the real world, probably as you stumble upon stuff that you realize in your business, oh, we were working on this assumption and this team over here was working on another assumption, you know, to continue to drive that clarity and redefine what you mean with stuff as you go.
Love it. Love
I doubt anybody has perfect data.
No, I don't think anybody's data is perfect. But the better we can make it, the better we'll be, right? Lucy, how do you think about that? How do you think about how you work on ensuring your data is of the highest quality and trustworthiness you can?
Yeah, so the team that I lead, revenue development, they often join the company from outside, and so something that's very top of mind for me is, how do we enable the teams when there is manual data entry? How do we make sure that they are set up for success? So giving them clear definitions, but also letting them know how the data is going to be used. Because it's very easy to say, well, I don't need to fill out that call outcome. But then when you say, oh, but there's lots of people no-showing my meetings, well, there's no data, right? Yeah. So if we really help people see the importance of the data, help them see that it's actually being used to improve their job, then that will really help people understand the need for the amount of manual entry that there may be. And I think that one of the areas in which AI can be most exciting is the ability to remove some of that manual data entry. There's a lot of talk at the moment about how there are products that can summarize calls, when then that could fill out that call outcome for us, and then that problem would be gone. So I really believe that, as you said, trying to minimize the manual data entry, make it as easy as possible, but very important, let people know why they should be invested. Because people want to do well and want to do well by the company. And so I think giving people that real true understanding of how the data is useful, that can make the real difference.
Yeah. And you've hit really the flavor of the year there in terms of AI. We're hearing so much more and more about AI, right? I'll come to you, Shantanu. Yeah. How are you coming into contact with AI in your field, and is it helping you yet?
So I think, and again, you're spot on. I think what Lucy just talked about here, AI, and there are different types of AI, right? I think generative AI or ChatGPT got generative AI literally the time in the spotlight. But if I think about there's generative AI, there's machine learning, there's natural language processing, and some of these, though the bottom two or the latter two have been in circulation for the last few years even. So if I think about from a RevOps lens, if I think about each of these three, machine learning, we talked about account scoring a long time ago, or lead scoring. A lot of that comes from creating machine learning to be able to give us signals about which kinds of accounts and which kind of leads are valuable versus not. So that's something which, again, in the RevOps world, we use a lot. And we now have better systems and better models to help us on that. Second thing, again, and I don't want to do a shameless plug for what we do at Gong, but basically both natural language processing and generative AI. In fact, the example Lucy just talked about, if you have a conversation which is recorded in Gong, you actually come out and have a summary, we call it Spotlight. And you can then feed that back into the CRM, so you're not having to go in and do a manual entry. And again, something which we've been enabling and testing with our internal teams. Similarly, natural language processing. I think Salesforce had a statistic that, I think I mentioned this, only about 5% of an actual conversation goes into your CRM. So how do you really, again, how do you add more time, and literally giving time back is massive for a sales team, because there's so many different research. Someone says 60%, someone says 70%, but less than 30% of a seller's time is spent in selling today. Right. So how do you really maximize that time? And again, AI is really helping us on that journey.
Fantastic, because we all know how much salespeople love CRMs and entering data into CRMs.
It's their favorite topic.
Yeah. Geraldine, how about you, AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, as Shantanu says, there's a lot of this had already been happening. Maybe people didn't have the AI tag on it, and even going back, 20 years, if you want to take something like forecasting, taking historical data, putting it into a model, that is probably what we would call AI right now. You get a predictive output on the other side. So I'm really excited about what we can do. We're seeing a lot of it, whether it's on, not just on the RevOps side, but also on the sales side and on the marketing side. There's a huge amount of stuff that can be done. I think there's a lot happening, and I think the big challenge is to make sure you don't just take the first thing that you see because it has AI, but really ask yourself, is this a need that we need to fix in our business right now? Is it going to save us time? Is it going to improve our operations? These are the type of questions to be asking, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, this is a cool new thing, so I should be taking it on board in my business. So in the same way that you talk about RevOps being in decision-making cycles, having that level of due diligence and thoughtfulness about what you bring in, because you're bringing effectively more into your tech stack by doing that. So making sure that it will truly solve a problem, as opposed to just be a new exciting thing. I think that's the big thing to work through over the next
be outcome driven rather than jumping on trends, and understand what it is you're going to achieve. Right?
That's it.
And how it disrupts or complements the ecosystem you've got at the moment.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
Fantastic. And one thing I want to talk to you guys about today, we're talking about revenue operations and the rise of RevOps. Of course, we're on the sales think tank, right? And I, like a lot of our audience, are salespeople at heart, and we're probably running into the revenue ops persona more and more in our complex deals and our big deals. How do you think salespeople should be engaging with revenue ops for them to, I suppose, speak their language and ultimately be successful in those engagements and find those win-wins? Who'd like to
I could take a crack at that because I think I've been in a couple of those conversations on the other side, wearing the RevOps persona hat. So if I think about, and maybe this is in general very useful for anyone thinking about doing a deal or running a deal cycle with RevOps, and I do believe, given all we've talked about, RevOps has definitely entered the chat in most of these decisions. It's been an evolution over the last few years. So I think there's two things which are very important. Most RevOps leaders or people that you talk to, their favorite word will be efficiency.
Right.
So the more efficient you are as a seller, the more clear you are, and this is why I'm here, this is what I want to show you, this is the expectation, clear outcome. They're going to be very, very happy. Second, it's actually helping your deal cycle. In fact, we saw, even in Gong data, that we saw a 20% higher win rate in deals where RevOps was involved early in the cycle versus later, was because they have very clear criteria.
Right.
So like, for instance, if I know, and I think it goes back to what Lucy and Geraldine mentioned as well, if you have 4 or 5 specific things you want to solve for, the problem you're solving for, this is the system which solves for it. And that's something which RevOps very, very clearly thinks, or any RevOps executive would think along that line. And I think those two pieces, the more time efficient you are and very clear on what the goals are and how you check the boxes.
Interesting. So we should all, I think any salesperson working on a complex deal should always be what we call at LinkedIn multi-threaded, right? They should understand who are the key individuals that will be involved in this deal, who are the stakeholders, and how successfully have I mapped them, and where RevOps is clearly going to be involved. Get them in early, right?
Absolutely.
Get them in early, speak their language. Don't throw your language on top of them. Understand what it is they want. And if you do that effectively and efficiently, to use your words, Shantanu, you'll probably accelerate things and win more.
You can win more, absolutely.
All right, fantastic. So we probably shouldn't be too concerned when we see RevOps pop up and welcome.
Exactly. And in fact, if I think about and I'm assuming a lot of our customers, our speakers, listeners might be SaaS companies.
Yes. So
for a SaaS company, if you have a renewal instance coming in the future, even if you've not sold through RevOps, it is in the end the RevOps person who will be the custodian of the system going forward. So if you've not got RevOps in the conversation, it will be a challenge for you a year down the line, 2 years down the line when the renewals come up.
That's a really interesting observation. I work a lot with people involved in existing customer business where exactly that challenge, where they're renewing contracts, and they're renewing contracts with the traditional personas they've dealt with, and then they find out very late in the piece that Revenue Ops is now involved. But like we say, like we've been talking about, Revenue Ops is the rising role really in our space right now, and then you need to engage early, right?
I think also RevOps has a bigger perspective because a recent example, we brought SalesLoft into Funnel, and it was brought in by a sales team. But as soon as we had revenue operations involved, we realized that, of course, the revenue development team needed to be involved too. So RevOps have that bigger perspective, that view across all of the revenue roles. So from a sales perspective, it's in your interest to have the revenue ops involved because they might actually grow your deal for you by having that bigger company understanding and breaking the silos.
And if you can help them understand what's in it for them, then they can help you understand everybody that needs to be involved and progress the conversation in the right manner.
And I think also a piece from a seller perspective is to think about, we talk about RevOps growing significantly, but the seniority of who leads that revenue operations function is growing with that as well as the remit of it grows. And so often, for me, I will ask my RevOps team to be the final decision maker in the deal, and so not to feel afraid. If RevOps is there, it's a great thing, and not to discount them as just somebody that they need to have as part of the deal cycle, but they may actually be the decision maker or the economic buyer who owns the budget to go out and make that decision. So I think it's interesting to see how it evolves, and I think as RevOps are coming in to really assess what is their role in the deal, it may not just be a supporting role, but actually it may be the lead role that they're playing in the deal process.
Yeah. Fantastic. I was going to stay with you for the next question, Geraldine, to talk really about this old chestnut of sales and marketing alignment, right? It's a new problem, I've heard. Do you think it's important, excuse the leading question, how important is it that the business success is founded on that strong alignment between sales and marketing, and how do you deal with that challenge today?
For me, it's absolutely critical and vital, and I think particularly in a world where you're much more data driven. In Personio, we actually do something quite radical where the marketing team report directly to me, so we have sales and marketing together as one function.
I think all salespeople are like, yeah, that's how it should work.
But actually what's happened as a result of that, I've led that team for over 3 years now. It is probably the most collaborative sales marketing partnership I've ever seen in my career, and that's because they're sitting in the same meetings, having the same discussions, they're sitting in the same planning sessions, and then ultimately we're all making the decisions, and if something goes wrong, we all have the conversation in the room together. So it's not rolling up through different reporting chains and getting sitting in different priorities of who's going to fix what when. I think in Personio it works incredibly well having the two together, and I am seeing that as more and more of a trend, that the two are coming together under one roof, and particularly in the SaaS world, because I think you can see the power that it generates. And talking to both the sales and marketing teams in my organisation, they really enjoy it, and they all say, it's not just me, but they all say how much they enjoy working together as two collaborators.
Fantastic.
So maybe what we do is a little bit radical, but it's certainly really effective.
It sounds effective. I love it. Lucy, how do you think about this old chestnut sales and marketing alignment?
Revenue development, talk about being between the rock and the hard place, right? There's marketing, revenue development, and sales. So for us, it's really the lifeblood. It's the lifeblood of my entire organization, and something that I think is really important is making sure that we're all driving in the same direction. So at Funnel, we have a really collaborative approach to the sales and marketing relationship, which is honestly so refreshing. And I truly believe that it's because we all share one common goal, which is pipeline generated. We're all looking at one common metric, which means that, again, looking at data, we're not having one piece of data thrown at us from marketing and another thrown at us from sales. No, we're all looking at the same number and all driving towards that same number. But it's also, as you said, all about collaboration, being in that same room. So every week I'm meeting with the VP of marketing, the VPs of sales, CMO, CRO. It's making sure that we're always talking. And also the teams. So we have this constant open feedback loop between the revenue development reps who are working those leads, creating those deals, and the marketing team. And it's amazing because we don't have that barrier of, oh, don't tell me how to do my job. It's very much like, oh, we've seen this trend. Here's the data to show it. And then marketing say, oh, yes, you're right. Okay, that came from that campaign. That's now stopped. And that can happen in a day. So that great collaboration means that actually the business is more efficient. So it is vital, as Geraldine was saying.
Yeah, so strong collaboration based on good communication, proximity to each other, listening.
Joint goals.
Joint goals. Joint goals.
Yeah.
Love joint goals. Shantanu.
Yeah, I think, and by both the perspectives, because again, I think there's an organizational way to fix the challenge. And in the absence of the organization being one, and I know that, as Geraldine said, you're definitely pioneering that piece, but there are more and more companies moving toward that true CRO model with marketing and sales reporting into them. There are two things which I think both of you touched on, which I think are crucial, is how do we get the forums of intersection? Even if it's not an organizational design which helps that, how do you get more chances for marketing and sales to be in the same room, driving to the same goal? I think that's number one. And number two, we talk about incentive alignment. I would almost think about what is the actual dollar goal for each of the teams. Is it pipeline? Is it revenue? How do you drive more alignment around that? And the team which is helping on both, at least in my experience, is RevOps again. If you Google, we talked about AI. If you Google what does RevOps do on what is revenue operations on ChatGPT, it will talk about aligning the go-to-market functions. And a large part of that is if you do have, even where you have separate sales and marketing teams, if you have an unbiased RevOps team which works across both, then you can have that one view of data, one view of where you're headed, and creating those forums of intersection, I like to call them, to have the conversations.
Yeah, I think the alignment of goals is huge, right? We work with obviously thousands of customers in LinkedIn, and it's always, we have a particular report we can show about, here's where your marketing team are focusing their efforts on LinkedIn, and here's where your salespeople are focusing there. And we sometimes ask the client, what percentage continuity are you expecting to see there, and their expectations and what's reality are often very, very far apart. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Shantanu, in terms of, how do you align your goals, and are you all seeking seeking the same thing, right? Geraldine, forecasting, right? It's an old art for all of us in sales, but I think where revenue operations have probably had something to add in the evolution of this old art. Are you seeing much of that? Are you seeing RevOps change how forecasting is done?
Yeah, for sure. Without want to also give a shout out to my amazing RevOps team who have built an incredible forecasting tool. And sometimes, I think I have all of the data points. I have the forecasting tools that they give me. I have all of the inputs from the team. I can see what's happening in Gong. I can see what's happening in Salesforce. And yet my RevOps forecast is always the most accurate forecast that I get. Whether it's much higher than I had expected or lower, it's a real honesty keeper for me. And so for me, RevOps plays a really vital role in that. And, there's quite a lot of external forecasting tools out there, but for me, having an internal approach to doing that, because you know your business much better than any other solution can give to you, it's a really vital place to do it.
Sometimes a dose of humility for the sales leader when the cross-functional partner with all the data and the more focus on really understanding that data is the one who comes out with that stone cold accurate forecast.
Yeah, that's it. And for us, our forecast with RevOps, it updates on a daily basis. So this is the rate that it's updating at, and it's really good to keep things honest and to make sure that we have that level of focus within the teams. I think the important piece is not just the data, but how you use the data. So having your RevOps team sitting in the forecast call and actually challenging, well, hey, this is what this number shows. And remember, last quarter we said this, and we call this, and you call that, and this is where we landed, to continue to have that open level of conversation and also to bring people along the journey. Sales leaders will often think, well, I'm closer to the deals than the data is. I'm on those calls. And so having that, constant conversation about how the two work together is really helpful.
It's challenging for sales leaders or salespeople in those moments, right, where somebody presents you data and says, hey, you might think this, but the data suggests, but ultimately it does lead to better outcomes and more accurate forecasting as long as everybody's comfortable with the engagement and comfortable with being challenged. It can make things just more accurate for everybody, right?
Yeah, that's it.
How does this work for you, Lucy?
So at Funnel, it's very simple. It's RevOps who own the forecast.
Right.
We have a weekly meeting, and it's RevOps who present the forecast.
Great.
So that just shows how fundamental it is. But I also believe that it's really important to enable the teams, because as you say, RevOps will pull their forecast from all sorts of different places, and the teams are the ones who are there on the ground. And to avoid that kind of friction with that forecast, it's enabling them to understand how the forecast is built and how they can gain from it. Because if they think, oh, this deal is rock solid, and there's a piece of information that they're missing, then actually that should be seen as a help, and so again, keeping that enablement, that communication alive, which helps the sales team be more successful, that's really going to be the key to making everybody win.
Okay, I think Lucy's speaking your language, Shantanu.
Definitely speaking my language. And if I think I used the term triangulation earlier, right? And I love the fact that Funnel is obviously where RevOps is. This is literally the number one priority or task for a RevOps team is to get focused, right? That's I know it would be across all those 3-4 pillars I mentioned. But if I think about the beauty of what you just said, and if I match that with Geraldine, and you mentioned the top down, I think there's a top down number and a bottom up number, right? So how do you merge both together? Because top down, this is where machine learning driven AI comes in. Right. This is where all the models that you build and come in. What's the data telling you? And then bottom up, literally, how do you get whatever you're getting insights from the market, from based on what you're having customer conversations? What's that telling you? And therefore your team is building up that number. And the merger is going to be hopefully in the right space. And also like the distinction you made about, it's not about beating your forecast, it's about being within a margin of error.
Yes.
And whether it's up or down, so long within a small error. That's great. Yeah, love it.
Brilliant. Okay. I want to talk for a moment about KPIs, if I can, key performance indicators, and specifically around strategy, right? So what key performance indicators do you use to ensure that your sales strategy is successful, and how do you drive these metrics to gain improvement?
Yeah. I'm happy to start. So I look at a range of KPIs. Some of them are daily, some of them are weekly, some of them are monthly, and some of them are quarterly, depending on how fast they're going to move or how important they are to the business. So, starting at the very top, pipeline close rate, understands where you are going to be this quarter, but then over a longer period, understanding how are AEs performing on average, how are certain territories working out, and by territories I mean specific markets or regions versus others, and then beyond that, how does that work within the cost envelope that you're managing as well. Again, with those some metrics you do want to look at every single day. Some of those metrics aren't going to change day by day, and actually looking at them sometimes too frequently can give you a false sense that things are working all right, because you don't see that trend line moving. So sometimes looking at things over a longer horizon allows you to make better and more strategic decisions on stuff.
Nice. Shantanu, Lucy, are there any KPIs that specifically help you understand how your strategy is effective if you're being successful?
So revenue development and sales in general is an area in which the KPIs, I think, have really shifted over the past couple of years. It used to be all about like the number of activities, right? The number of deals, the number of emails, whatever, etc. And I think there's been a really big and quite important positive shift towards what are the leading indicators that are actually moving the needle. So we're seeing a shift away from 150 dials to what's that conversion rate looking at. So we're a Swedish-based company, and so we're very consultative and collaborative. I'm actually running at the moment a complete review of our KPIs with the team, because they have to also be motivating for the team to look at. It's got to be something that helps you drive business, not like drag it along the floor. So that's something that we're really working on right now, is making sure that we're refreshing the KPIs and not just going blindly with what we used to do, but really looking towards what is going to move the needle and get us to where we need to go.
The only and I love you mentioned leading indicators there, because to me it's all about inputs versus outputs, and I think it's the more focus you have on inputs during the phase and outputs after the fact is pretty important. But the one and I'll do is also the KPIs matter different depending on the level you're looking at, and what I mean by that is why a certain metric matters is very different for, say, when you're wearing a CRO hat versus a seller. So it's really important to what are the top 2 or 3 things at each level, and why is it important? You need it because you need to forecast to the board. A seller probably needs it because they're going to know if they're going to hit their number or not. So it's very different at different levels, and how do you really almost create an orchestra around that KPIs across those different levels, and then you measure not more than 2 or 3. As you mentioned, you have all these different frequencies. How do you know what the top 2 which matter at each frequency? So that's the measure, or the mixing of both, which is so important.
Okay. Final question for me, because we are close on time, is, and it's probably one that a lot of people have dealt with in the last 15 to 18 months, is how do you ensure your sales strategy is adaptable to changing market conditions and customer needs? How do you work that conundrum that we've probably seen more in the last 18 months than in the preceding 5 years, I think, for a lot of people? Geraldine, something
happy to take that. I think the last 18 months, 3 years have been very volatile in many different ways. I think first and foremost you have to have a strategy, and you have to have a point of view and start with that and understand, okay, what are we doing with that, and then from there understanding, okay, so where do we need to vary, what are we learning about what's happening in each of the markets that we're in, and how do we adjust from it? Do we need to fundamentally adjust? Is it a 180, or do we need to tweak by 5, 10, 15% on stuff, or do we need to change different types of investments around what we're doing? And that can vary from like very, very macro right up to like investments per market, right down to kind of much more tactical around, well, what are the right channels that we're investing in this month to get the maximum output. So starting with your first point of view, and then from there understanding where you need to adjust. And I think continually to have that conversation. We spoke a lot about data today, but I think also taking that qualitative input in as well, to make sure that you're using both data but also that kind of qualitative view on feedback that you're hearing in the market, to make sure you get those 2 pieces right.
So we've all got our strategy, but we all need to have the flexibility to understand that, hey, things can change, right?
And if I love that you mentioned qualitative feedback, because to me it's all about the voice of the customer and the external feedback loop that you're getting there, because I think Lucy had talked about not looking at volume of activity, but it's the content and the context that matters so much. I'll take an example. We launched a new narrative or a positioning to adapt to the market in February, and we've been able to track it. Again, we drink our own champagne. We've been listening into the conversations and tracking that and measuring that against win rates, and we noticed that strategy 1 improved win rates by X. Strategy 2 did not work as well. So you're able to then go back and change that
Yes.
And it goes back to hearing the voice of the customer. And that to me has been the biggest shift. The more and more we can map our data to actually what the customers are saying, and then influence our
So
strategy.
constantly testing, iterating, listening to your customers, and not, to Geraldine's point, not being too fixed on the strategy you started with, and being adaptable.
And for me, I'd like to add in that enablement here is key, because the people you're getting that anecdotal evidence from is the team, the reps who are having those conversations daily and who have to deliver all the way through a pandemic and a war and all the other fun things that are that we've had to face up to in the past couple of years. And I think it's really important that we enable the teams so that they're not fixed, right? So it's not about teaching them a pitch, it's about teaching them skills so that they can connect with the people on the other end of the deal and use the plethora of skills that they have been trained on to adapt to those market conditions, but also to each deal. Because at the end of the day, every single conversation is unique and they need to be able to make that true connection, and that is what brings that agility in the moment.
Yeah.
So I think it's lovely that you said enablement is part of revenue operations in your view, because it really does build into that strategy.
Yes.
Yeah. So, there's a place and time for templates and pitches, but it's also essential we don't become over-reliant on them, and that we develop our skills and the skills of our sales organization to be able to adapt as and when needs. Well, thank you all. I've really enjoyed talking to you today and hearing and sharing in your wisdom. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
We will have to leave it there, as that's all the time we have for today on this topic. I would like to thank all my guests today for taking part in our webinar show and for sharing with us their expertise. And to you, our audience, for joining us today. We hope you've got a few useful takeaways from our discussion, and we hope to see you again soon for another episode of the LinkedIn Sales Think Tank. Now remember, you can still ask any last-minute questions in the Q&A box, and we will respond to you. Or we've got loads of useful sales resources available to you on our website or by following the LinkedIn Sales Solutions blog. That's it for now. Bye, and thank you for joining us.